Okay, welcome to our eighth and final lecture. Again, this is a 5-minute overview. It's not meant to substitute for what you're going to be doing, both listening to the in-class lecture and reviewing it, but this should give you a quick framework of the chapters. We're going to cover really 4 chapters, so we'll move fast to stay within our kind of 5-minute time limit. Excuse me if I go a bit over, it's possible here. Okay, we're going to be looking at chapter 32, which is really the formation of, and all these chapters involve employment, the formation of agency and principal. We'll look at the implications of whether you are an agent, a principal, employee, independent contractor, and the duties that are really applied to both. So the term, we're going to start off talking about some of the old terminology that developed, the terminology of master and servant, and how by the time the more modern capitalist society evolved, we began to really kind of lose that pejorative term and start using employee as our primary term. And then as our society got a little bit more complex, independent contractor. Then we will look at the framework of that employment law, both the statutory law, the common law, even some administrative law like IRS regulations. The big implications of this that we're going to focus on in this first chapter is tax liability. Tax liability for the employer primarily. And we'll also look at liability for torts that might be committed or acts that might be committed, representations, even contracts that can be entered into. We will look at the duties of the agent. We'll look at the duties of the principals in both whether we're talking about employee or whether we're talking about independent contractor, and how this changes and evolves. Chapter 33, we're going to shift just a little bit, focusing mainly on agents. We'll drill down a little bit. We'll look at authority and liability there. Then we'll shift a little to principal liability, broadly more torts, and then independent contractors. So for agent authority, we'll talk about how it arises. We'll talk about the major types of agency, although we'll pretty much focus on the standard ones. We'll look at how agency can be limited. Then we'll look at why it's important, what the individual's, the subjective point of view is, what is the agent's perspective on what he's supposed to be doing, what's the principal's perspective. Then we'll flip it and we'll look from the outside, and we'll talk about when third parties interact with agents and with principals and what they can reasonably expect and sometimes even impose. We'll look at the status of agents. We'll talk about whether to disclose, that is, we know what they are. We'll talk about the scope of the agency, what's their overall objectives, most commonly accomplishment of some specific task. Then we'll look at when they deviate from this, whether it's minor, it's usually called a detour, or whether it's significant, a frolic, and how those two things interact and what they can mean. We will look at principles here. We'll look at different types of principles that can exist. We'll look at when principals essentially lend out agents, and then the types of torts that arise and how they have liability through their agency. We're going to focus again, we're going to turn, because it's such an important concept, and look at IC, which is independent contractors. And we're going to look at who actually sets some practical rules in the real world. I mentioned before, we'll look at some administrative agencies such as the IRS and how this can have a very significant impact. By chapter 34, we are looking at some of the broader pieces of employment legislation. Employment at will is going to be a big topic we're going to discuss. Early legislation, primarily labor union legislation. The rise of administrative regulation, kind of a supplement and a substitute. And finally, general major pieces of federal legislation. So we'll start off with the idea of freedom of contract, what's usually called employment at will. Talk about how there was abuse by employers, how there was a reaction from labor, and how the state, in order to maintain both peace and to maintain a capitalist society, was really required to intervene. So the rise of the regulatory state. We'll look at how these initial regulations were put in place, things like wage laws, child labor laws, hours and regulation of hours over time. Then we'll look at how that kind of transitioned from a kind of direct to a less direct, health and safety becoming a focus. Occupational Safety and Health Administration being created, workers' compensation, Social Security. All of these will be a focus of what we'll talk about. Then we'll look at specific, more modern legislation, starting with models like workers' comp, moving up through old age insurance, which is basically Social Security, unemployment insurance, COBRA, which is your medical leave, and then most recently the Affordable Care Act, which is a major piece of legislation, something new we can really discuss. By 35, we're looking at types of discrimination. We're going to be moving into sexual discrimination, harassment, offenses, and how the states treat